Hi everyone. So today we're going to talk about chapter 12 on problem solving and reasoning. So in this chapter we focus mostly on problem solving and what problem solving entails. And specifically, we're going to focus on different ways that we can solve problems. And then lastly, we'll take a closer look at some differences between how experts and novices actually solve problems. So let's first start out with talking about why problem solving skills are invaluable. So problem solving in general involves the application of ideas, skills, or factual information to achieving a solution to a problem or to reach a desired outcome. And as you can see in this picture here, right, it's kind of a long process, right? First, you have to identify that there is a problem and then define it, try to explore different solutions, take an action, and then most of the time before you actually reach a solution, you actually have to look back, maybe readjust, maybe try a different method, right? Sometimes it's actually trial and error before you reach a solution. So it's a very circular process. And I also wanted to put this in context because it's obviously one of the chapters where we look at how cognition and all the different pieces that we've already talked about, including working memory and attention and things like that, how they all work together quite nicely to allow you to have this higher order cognitive skill. And this is not just important for cognitive psychology, but actually also everyday life. So I recently found an article published by Forbes that actually listed problem-solving skills as one of the top 4 skills that employers are looking for in their employees. And in case you're wondering what the other 3 are, so the top 4 skills that they were looking for in people were attention to detail, so not making little errors when you're doing work, using correct formatting, making sure that documents and things like that look professional and perfect. They're also looking for people that have more than just a college education. And I don't mean by that you have to go to graduate school, but nowadays with so many people having college degrees, having a college education is sometimes necessary, but it's not necessarily sufficient. So people are also looking for somebody who's really career ready. And then, as I already mentioned, right, agility was the one that was really important, and that, of course, includes problem-solving skills and being able to adapt to a rapidly changing world. And then, last but not least, humility was also an important factor for employers. So looking for somebody that can admit a mistake, works well with others, and doesn't take themselves too seriously. So in educational psychology, we typically say that there's school or academic problems that we can solve, but then there's also everyday problems that we a lot of times have to solve. An example of a school problem, right, would be, doing well on your Mem and Cog exam, or being able to solve an algebraic equation, or being able to memorize different body parts for your anatomy class. An example of an everyday problem-solving skill would be, being able to live within your means. So being able to use the money that you take in and pay all your bills with it. Or, another example would be maybe maintaining a long-term relationship while you're in college for 4 years. So there's lots and lots of different examples of how problem solving is important in, obviously your work and in school, but also in everyday life. So as I already mentioned, educational psychologists are especially concerned with problem solving, and they typically differentiate between well-defined problems that make it very clear what's expected of you, and there's usually a very clear solution to a problem for a well-defined problem. But then there's also a poorly defined problem where really the outcome is more abstract and confusing, so it's not really clear what's needed or what even the goal state sometimes should be. An example of a well-defined problem is where, you can say something like, list 10 presidents and important achievements that they made during their tenure. So a poorly defined problem would be something where you just say something like, think about the history, but you're not specifically told what to know about history. So it's poorly defined and you don't exactly know what the expectations are. So every problem has typically three features. There's, of course, this initial state where you're being faced with a problem. So you have to recognize there is a problem, define what the situation is. And then you also have to think about what is the goal supposed to be, right? What would be, when you consider something to be solved, right? What's the end goal that you're looking for? And then, of course, in between, sandwiched between the initial and the goal state are the obstacles, right? The restrictions that you need to overcome to actually move from the initial state to the goal state. And if you play games maybe online, right? If you play computer games, right? There's typically, obviously, you want to get to the end of the game, but there's different levels. But then there's also obstacles that you have to overcome. And again, that could be, again, an academic example, but it could also be, an everyday kind of example where you have to solve a problem. So to make this a little bit more tangible and well-defined, I'm going to give you an example of this in just a second. But before I move on to that, also very quickly, one other thing that I want you to recognize is that, right, a lot of times in school, you are faced with routine problems, right? Where, for instance, in the statistics class that I teach, right, I give people, the formulas and the steps that they need to take to, let's say, calculate an independent group's t-test or an ANOVA. And you can always trust that you can follow those steps. So that would be a routine problem. But then there's also non-routine problems where, you're faced with a challenge and it doesn't really kind of follow this routine that you're already used to. So non-routine problems are typically more difficult to solve because they require you to think outside the box and maybe let go of some of the strategies that you've used in the past and try something new, apply critical thinking to a new problem. So on this next slide here, I have a little riddle for you. So the instructions say that you need to use two squares, and they have to be exact squares, not rectangles. So use those two squares to make separate pens for the 9 pigs. So once you're ready, I would like for you to pause the video for a couple of minutes and just try to solve the problem. It might require you to actually take a piece of paper and maybe try different things and draw on a piece of paper those 9 different piggies and maybe draw in different squares and try different things. So why don't you try that for a few minutes, and then when you're ready, press the play button again. All right, so I think you've given this a good try. So some of you may have been able to figure this out. Maybe some of you are still struggling and you get a little frustrated. So here's my cursor. So I'm going to show you how you actually solve the problem. So again, we make 2 squares. So the first square you could actually draw right here around that middle piggy. So you draw 1 square like this. And then you draw your second square like a diamond. So you go from here to here, to here, to here, to here, making sure that the lines touch that inner square right here. So you end up with all 9 piggies being in their individual little pens. So this problem is a great example where you did have to think outside the box a little bit because, when you are usually faced with a problem like this, right, you probably start out like, okay, I can draw a square around these guys and then maybe one here, right? But that didn't really help you with this particular problem. It didn't lead you to the solution. So to reach the solution, you had to think outside the box and kind of think about it in a different way. But usually after some trying things out and trial and error, you usually do come to the solution. So in general, right, when we solve these problems, we like to represent them. Sometimes it actually helps to write things out, right? I mean, I like to make my to-do lists. They really help me visualize the problem and what my end goals are, and then I can kind of tick individual steps off the list. And then even with the problem that I just gave you, right, it actually helps if you draw the 9 little piggies on a piece of paper, and then you can actually try different things out with a pencil that you can erase. So certainly representing your problem and drawing it out sometimes helps. And of course, it really depends on what the problem is, what the best method to represent it is. But certainly, using a visual, especially if it's not something that you can just manipulate in your mind, but using your working memory is a really great way to go about doing this. All right, so I'm going to stop here, and then we're going to move on to talking about Wolfgang Kohler's chimps, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Insight problem next.